Okay. Good morning. With the help of Hashem, we are learning Yerushalmi Shvi'is. We are starting today the 8th chapter, Klal Godoil Amru. So Perik Ches Halacha Aleph. We are learning Daf Samach. We're starting on Daf Samach, Amid Aleph, all the way on top of the Amid. This Mishnah will discuss which uses are permissible to be done with products that pose the Kedusha of Shvi'is. Now, we already learned to Klal Gadol in the previous chapter that what products are included, what plants are included in Kedusha Shvi'is, Michael Adam, Michael Behema, Mina Tzivainim, and we inquired in the Gemara various other questions, right? Plants that are used for perfume, v'chulei. Here, the question is not what is imbued with Kedusha Shvi'is. Here, the question that we will be addressing is that once an item is sanctified with the sanctity of Shvi'is, for what may it be used? Now, obviously, human food may be eaten, animal food may be consumed. Minit Tzivainim, we already learned in the previous chapter, not only may be used for dyeing, it may also be used for human consumption. The focus of our Mishnah will be regarding melugma. Now, Chevre, melugma is a plaster that was made from food. It was actually made by chewing on it, as we'll read inside the Mahara Fulda. And that's why maloi, lugma, which are words that we are familiar with, right? When it comes, let's say, to drinking koishal bracha, what's the minimum amount you have to drink? Maloi lugma and other shiurim by Inoy of Yom Kippur. Maloi lugma means it was a plaster or a certain type of bandage. Either it was used for medicinal purposes or it was used for cosmetic purposes. But the way they did it then is that they would take certain items, certain food items, and they would chew on it. And somehow, maybe because the spittle has some medicinal properties, that is called melugma. And the discussion will be whether we can use human food for melugma for a human, for an animal, whether we can use animal food to make that into a melugma la'adam, maybe lebehema. That will be the general topic of the Mishnah. And after the Mishnah will establish the rule, the Gemara is going to be searching for the scriptural sources for the rule, and we're going to have throughout this discussion or the search for sources the following. I'm not going to call it a klal gadol, but the Gemara says like this: that kol medrish sha'at doidish v'shoiver medrish rishon ein ze medrish, which means many times you have two psukim, one after the other. From the first pasuk, there's something extra. You make a drasha. You make an exposition, and you come to a certain ruling, and then you read the next pasuk, and you can follow the same logic by making a similar type of exposition. But if the second drasha will completely take away the first drasha, then the second drasha is not valid. Not that neither of them are valid, because if you use that logic, use it always. And if you can't use it, then you can never use it. We don't say that. There are certain ways of learning psukim, and therefore certain drashas are made. But if the next pasuk, if by using the same logic, you're going to come to an opposite conclusion, ein ze medrash, then the second exposition is not valid. And we're going to see how that will be used when it comes to our search. That will be the first topic of the Gemara, simply finding sources for the rulings of the Mishnah. Bottom line will be is that we will discover that a person is allowed to use animal food for human non-food purposes. You can take animal food and turn it into a melugma la'adam, not melugma lebehema, but yes, melugma la'adam. So once that will be established with the sources, the Gemara, let's see how far we'll get, we'll begin to inquire as to the scope of this permit. We're going to see whether we can amplify this permit or whether we're going to limit it only to the case of the Mishnah. That is Daf Samach, and now let's go and learn it inside. So begins the Mishnah with the words Klal Godoil Amru B'Shvi'is. Look inside the first Rashi Ilio. Kvar kosabnu l'mayla, because the previous chapter is also Klal Gadol. The Tana Hacha Klal Gadol, regarding the din of the melugma, which will be basically the one din of our Mishnah, that melugma may be made out of animal food, even though when you make it into a melugma, it's rendered inedible for animals, but it's not considered a downgrade. you're not taking away from its chashivus because it's being made for a plaster / medicinal bandage for a person. Mishum ta'af agav the ikanamer isu melugma v'schoire betrumas u'maiser sheni. Even though the same topic is discussed in trumas u'maisers, and over there the Rabbeinu HaKadosh did not share this rule by giving it the preface of klal gadol. Why is it a big klal? Like, it's a halacha that, you know, whether you could use melugma, whether you cannot use melugma. Afilo hachem mida the shvi'is adiflei. The shvi'is isei, since shvi'is itself is a broader umbrella, because what is imbued with the sanctity of shvi'is reminds us that Asherilio, not only oichli adam as it is by trumas u'maiser, but here it's bein oichli adam, bein oichli behema, and really even minei tzivoyim, that Asherilio doesn't even have to say that, because by truma and maiser sheni, what plant is going to be obligated in trumas u'maisers, etc. Only that which is primarily used la'oichli adam. Oichli behema is not mechuyev midoraisa to be tithed at all. So therefore, just explaining the klal gadol is because a lot more plants are going to be imbued with kedushas shvi'is vis-a-vis trumas u'maisers. So even though we're going to have the same halachas discussed in the next mesechtes, the preface of klal gadol is said when the din is a bigger din, when the din of shvi'is is a more inclusive din. I keep on forgetting to check. I'm almost sure that in Perek Klal Gadol, in Masechta Shabbos, in the Bavli, the Gemara there also, or at least the Rishonim, speak out. You know why? When is something called a Klal Gadol, and when is something called a Klal, and when is something just a halach? But this is called a Klal Gadol. And what's the Klal Gadol? So it says the Mishnah. Kol hamiyuchad lo'oichel adam. Meyuchad means, as we'll see in a moment, we already mentioned this concept, that there are certain items that when they grow in that locality, people use it for different purposes. And actually, some people might even use it for firewood. Anything that's going to be used for firewood will not be included in Kedusha Shvis. I know it's a broad umbrella, but it has to be Michael Adam, Michael Behema, Minit Tzivonim, not fuel. And certain items have to be designated with the intent of the owner prior to it being imbued with Kedusha Shvis. That's not what we're talking about here. Here we're speaking about a product that in the culture of this location, people primarily use it for food for humans, and therefore by default, it's miyuchad l'maychal adam. So says the Mishnah, that could be used for eating, but you may not use it for a non-food purpose, even le'adam. And the example that the Mishnah will continuously give is this melugma. Ein oisin mimenu melugma even la'adam. Look inside the top marafulda. Again, we spoke this out by the intro. That melugma means a tachboshes v'retiyah. So it's a certain type of plaster. It's a certain type of bandage that was used primarily for medicinal purposes. Sometimes it was used even for cosmetic purposes. You know, there's a very dry skin. You want to make the skin moist or whatever. So now, why are we calling a plaster or a bandage milugma? So Marafulda says uperush milugma. It's a composite of two words, miloi lugma, which is when you fill up your cheek with something. Why are we using that expression over here? Shederach b'nei adam. He's giving an example of what happened in the times of Chazal. Lil ois chitim. They would chew on wheat kernels. How much? Meloi lugma. They would fill up a cheek with wheat kernels and they would chew on it. And then if they would have a wound, they would take that and they would put it on their wound. And therefore, any type of plaster / bandage is called melugma. Okay. So again, you're using it for a human medicinal purpose. What's the issue? When something has kedusha, you have to treat it with a certain amount of chashivus, which includes you cannot downgrade its purpose. Human versus animal, human is more chashuv, animal is less chashuv. So you can't use it for animals. Here we're not using it for animals. We're using it for a human. Eloma, without making it into the plaster, you would consume it. You would eat it. Here, you're making it into some medicine. So that's the klal gadol. You may not do that. it's considered you're downgrading its purpose, and that touches, and that is machalal the kedusha of shvi'is. And therefore no need to say that it may not be used to make it into a plaster for an animal. Something that is miyuchad l'maychel adam, bottom line, may only be used l'maychel. Now, I'm not going to limit it mamish l'maychel. I'm going to use the words and similar, but not into a melugma. However, continues the Mishnah, v'chol she'einoi miyuchad l'maychel adam. Now, einoi miyuchad l'maychel adam is the way that Rabbi is wording it on for some reason, but he means something that's primarily designated for animal fodder, Not only, no problem, it's imbued with kedusha shvi'is. You can upgrade it. What would be an upgrade? Of course, if someone were to eat it, it's an upgrade. Michael Adam, Michael Behema went up to Michael Adam. But even if it's not going to be eaten by an Adam, even if it's going to be used for an Adam, but a non-food purpose, which will be the example melugma. Yes, oisin mimenu melugma lo Adam. But like Michael Adam may not be made into a melugma la Adam, Michael Behema may not be made into a melugma for a Behema. Okay, beautiful. Now, a big topic, a big part of today's daf will be Pashat Psukim. How do you know that? And actually, as we'll see in a moment, the laws of Adam and the laws of Behema l'chu'ura should have been the same. But we see they're not.
Rabbi.
Yes.
I know it's not mentioning it yet, but so what do you actually do? If you need something for an animal that comes from an item that would normally be used for humans,
take it from the
is it
6th year.
stuck?
Take it from the 6th year.
And
there was always produce. Maybe it would be more expensive. It's not so convenient. Now, chol she'eino miyuchad loy la'oichel adam v'loy la'oichel behema. Now, I know we just mentioned this concept in the previous chapter. So there are certain foods that people use it for various purposes. Some people are Adam, some people are Behema, some people for firewood. I'm mentioning firewood as an example because if something was grown for firewood, it's not included in Kedusha Shvi'is. Such a product, when harvested, if the owner who harvested it did not intend yet for what he'll be using it for, that item is not imbued with Kedusha Shvi'is. You need Kavana. So now, with such a product, says the Mishnah, if Choyshiv Olav Oichel Adam and Oichel Behema, what happens if you had both Kavanas? I'm harvesting it both La-Adam and La-Behema. You see, if you had Kavana La-Oichel Adam, okay, so now it has the rules of Oichel Adam. If you have Kavana Oichel Behema, so for example, then you would be allowed to use it L'Melugma La-Adam. That's the rule of Michael Behema. So now it's gavaldik. What happens if you have a product, when you harvested it, you had both kavanas, not or, and I'm using it for both. Can I now take some of it and make it melugma la adam? So says the Mishnah, no, you cannot. Noisnin olav chumrei adam v'chumrei behema. Its classification will always be both, and therefore, since Michael Adam may never be turned into Melugma La Adam, you cannot use it Melugma La Adam, even though it's also Michael Behema. Now, when the Mishnah says you give the chumras of both, what we don't yet have is, what is the chumrah of Michael Behema? That's something the Mishnah didn't mention. That's something we'll leave for the Gemara. The Gemara is going to search, what is this chumrah that you only find La Michael Behema that you impose on this product by giving the chumras of both on all of it. Okay, so we'll leave that half for the Gemara. Now, what happens if you harvested this product, chishuv olav le'etzim? That was your kavanah. So now, hareo ke'etzim, which means there is no kedusha shviyas at all. Taka, like we learned in the Rasharilio, kedusha shviyas is a lot more inclusive than trumas u'maisvus, but it's not on everything. Not something that was harvested for fuel, for firewood, or something that doesn't even need to have kavana. Certain woods, everyone, by default, it's used for firewood. It's not included in any of the dinim of Shvi'is. And the examples will be, we just learned this. Kegoin hasiya, v'ha'esa v'hakurnis. These are all different types of plants that, let's say, they are multi-purpose products. In the times of the Mishnah, these things could change with time. But that's the way it was when the Chazal were here. Okay, the Mishnah gives an example for a reason. Let me just speak out the reason. What happens, Chavre, if someone is harvesting wheat? The guy is so wealthy and he has such an abundance of wheat that he wants to use his wheat for fuel, just as an example. And he had that kavanah when he harvested the wheat. Batla daitoi. No, it's the reason why the Mishnah gives an example of the Sia and the Ezev and the corn is to make it clear that if something is miyuchad l'maychal adam by the culture, by the zman and makoim, your kavanah will be insignificant. Only something that in the times of Chazal, like the Sia and the Ezev and the Kurnis, they are multi-purpose products. There is where your kavanah has the koyach to determine exactly what it will be. Okay. So now let's begin with the source. So meyuchad l'maychal adam may not be made melugma. Meyuchad l'maychal behema. Not only could it be upgraded l'maychal adam, the Mishnah doesn't have to mention it. The chiddush is that you are allowed to use it even for human non-food purposes. Melugma. Where do you know that from? Klal gadol amru b'shvis. So says the Gemara, Rabbi Bun bar Chiyam, Bo'o kumei Rab Ze'era. Actually, it's not only where we get that from. It doesn't make sense. Why not? Because both Oichle Adam and Oichle Behema are written in the Parsha. And if you would like to look inside the Torah Oira Shalom to read the entire pasuk. This is Bahar. So Vayikra Chafei pasuk Vav. The pasuk reads V'hoisa Shabbos Haaretz Lochem Loachla. These are key words. Loachla, you can say, means not lemalugma. It has to be eaten. Locha doesn't have to be eaten by you, to you, ula avdecha, ula amasecha, v'lesrircha, ula seishavcha, hagarim imach. And the next pasuk, that the Torah Or Shalom doesn't bring, but you know what? Look inside the Rashi Ilyo. Mamish the next pasuk. Vile vehemtecha, vile chaya, asher ba'artsecha, tihiyeh kol tfuasa lechoil. So both when the pasuk is speaking about food that's meant for humans, and the next pasuk that's speaking about food that's primarily designated by default for behemoths and chayas, the Torah uses both, in both cases, the words lechoil. That's the kasha of Rabbi Bun bar Chia is based on the presumption lechoil implies to eat. Something is designated l'maychel behema. If you give it to an adam to eat, at least it's being eaten. But why would we not learn lechoil from pasuk vav, same word lechoil and pasuk zayin, that you cannot use anything that's imbued with kedusha shvius for anything other than a consumption? Now, minei tzevoinim is not a problem, because minei tzevoinim, we learned already in the previous chapter that lochem is more inclusive. Something that's designated to be used as a dye is not meant to be eaten. That's something else. Lochem, for its designated purpose, which is for dyeing. But when it comes to ma'acholois, then l'chu'ura lecho lecho. That's his kasha. And therefore, since the Torah uses the same word of eating, ma chamis meimad, what did you see that led you to say that oichli adam ein oise mehen melugma? And the truth is, he knew what was seen. What was seen was the word lechol. So oichle behema, what there oise mehen melugma? Why? La'achla should always exclude the melugma. Gewaldik. So that was asked to Rab Zeta. So Amalei, Rab Zeta says, okay, let's take one pasuk at a time. So in Chafei pasuk Vav, when the Torah writes V'hoisa Shabbos ha'aretz lochem la'achla. So here, very bekitzer, the words are very, very brief. They're abbreviated. Miut. Now, the miut goes to what? That has to be understood. So I know that when I said in the Havamina, Rabbi Bun bar Chia's question was, la'achla is a miut, right? La'achla means to eat and not to anything other. La'achla to eat and not for non-food purposes. But that's not the way the Mefarshim understand the word miut. Actually, because if that would have been the case, the Rab Ze'era simply only would have quoted the word la'achla. It's really lochem la'achla. Now, Cheva, keep your finger in the Gemara. Look inside the Rashirilio. It's in middle of the left column, probably like 9 or 10 lines from the bottom. Lochem la'achla mi'ut, which means techi ksiv la'achla v'darshinan v'loy lemelugma. When we have that limud, you're right. The limud is learned from la'achla and not for non la'achla purposes. But gabi lochem u'depsiv. The miut is not going on the la'achla. It's beautiful. The miut is going to lochem. Why did the Torah have to write the words lochem? I know that we learned in the previous chapter a whole different limud, but he's going different. Lochem means that when are we memayit non-food? Only by lochem. Lochem means only foods that are for humans. Beautiful. Gabi lochem udechsiv. The mashma kol shehu miyuchad lochem. Only by the lochem, because in the pasuk Zayin, the Rashirilio quotes, in pasuk Zayin, the Torah Taka writes lechoil. The Torah does not write the word lochem there. Kol shemayuchad lochem yelachla, and la'achla means lochem v'loy l'refuah. So this already itself implies that if it's not Michael to lochem, then we're not limited with la'achla. Then we're not limited to the la'achla. Ha'oichle behema af limelugma le'odam. That's key. Not limelugma lebehema. Oh, af limelugma le'odam shari. Beautiful. Okay. So again, back in the Gemara. Miut means it's really two miuts. Lochem, la'achla is being memayit, non-la'achla. But that's not what he meant. That we knew from the kasha already. That when are we memayit, non-food may not be used, only by the lochem. Miut oichlei adam. It's excluding that the rule that you cannot use it lemelugma is only by oichlei adam. Miut only oichlei adam ein oisem hemelugma, implying that by Michael Behema, you are allowed to use it lemelugma. And to clarify, Michael Behema may not be used lemelugmas lebehema. Michael Behema could be used lemelugma la'adam. Oh, hold on. The problem with that is, I got a problem. That in pasuk Zayin that we just quoted, and you can read it in the Rashirilio again, when the pasuk says v'levehemtecha v'lachaya asher b'artzecha, the Torah could have ended there. Is the Torah speaking about foods, the pshat, foods for animals and chayas, tiya koltfu asa lechoil. You can't deny the fact that you have the word lechol written also by animal food. And lechol means lechoil v'loy l'refuah. That's the end of the question. Right? Look, that's the Rashirilio. Again, uparech umiyat oichli behema de bekra nami ksiv. It says in pasuk Zayin regarding oichle behema, tiya called fuasa lechoil. Says the Gemara. Don't forget, guys, we have a word lochem in pasuk vav that you don't have on pasuk Zayin. So the drasha that we made was lechoil means lechoil and not for non-food, and the lochem. The exposition of the lachem is that this limitation of le'echoil v'loy l'refuah is only by the lochem, by human food. Now, if you're going to darshan lechoil consistent with the way you darshan it in pasuk vav, which would make sense, lechoil v'loy l'refuah, it would completely undo the previous darash. So now we're learning a big klal. So says the Gemara, Amar Abun Bar Chia, that's the klal, that kol medrash at doirish, that if you expound something, and you're doing it rightfully so, because we're being consistent. Lechol means lechol v'loy for non-lechol, v'loy l'refuah. But if you're going to do that, you're going to be shoiver midrash rishon. You're going to completely nullify the previous exposition drasha. Ein ze medrash. Oh, now hold on. He doesn't speak it out. So what's the solution? The solution is not the darshan lechol. Let's go. Lechol means lechol v'loy l'refuah. But I'll tell you what that means. I have a way of learning in pasuk Zayin by the animal lechol v'loy l'refuah, and it's not going to be shoiver the first drasha. I'll tell you how. Michael behema is not allowed to be used for melugma lebehema. Where do I get that from? Lechoil v'loy l'refuah. But if I'm going to limit that only lebehema, I'm going to still allow the drasha of pasuk vav to stand. What was the drasha of pasuk vav? That when do we say lechoil v'loy l'refuah? Only by lochem. But by behema, you could use it l'refuah. And I'll tell you how I'll work it out. By Michael behema, I cannot use it l'refuah's behema from pasuk Zayin's lechoil v'loy l'refuah. Michael behema could be used l'refuah's adam, and I'm using that from the lochem in pasuk vav. Gavaldik. Okay. Says the Gemara, I'll give you another source, an alternative source. Rabbi Yosi loy amar chen. He didn't respond. He didn't learn the limud of the klal gadol in the Mishnah the way Rab Zeta learned it. Elo, he learned it like this. Same psukim. When it says in Chafei pasuk vav, v'hoisa Shabbos haaretz lochem lo'achla, and then miyet, like we learned before, miyet means just from the words lo'achla, lo'achla. But it says in the next pasuk by the behemtecha ulachaya, tia kol tfuasa lechoil. That's in the next pasuk. And again, lechoil is to eat and not l'refuah. So you have actually twice, one after the other, lechoil being memayat achila. So there's a klal. This is the way you learn. And that's called the miyut achar miyut. If you have an exclusion, a double negative, and a double negative is coming to include something. Miyut achar miyut is lerabois, and let's follow the girsa, lerabois oich lebehema she'oisen mehen melugma la'adam. Frag the Gemara, if you're using the klal, that every time you have two psukim, one after the other, and each one is wording it in a way where it's excluding. But a double exclusion is a inclusion. Once you begin including, so the Rabbi oichle adam, why don't you say that even oichle adam could be used? You can't do that. Now we're going to use the rule that we just learned on Amud Aleph, is Ikai, the Amar Rabbi Bun Barchia, kol medresh ad doirish. But if you make the drasha, here in our case, miyut achar miyut, you're going to be shoiver midrash rishon, ein ze midrash. And Rab Matanya explains what he says. That kishum emato, when the first pasuk says achla, lochem le'achla, and we are excluding, what are we excluding? And that exclusion will stand oichli adamiyato. Now, when you have in the next pasuk the words la'achla, kisheripsa, what are we including? Only oichle behema ripsa for human plaster, for purpose of an adam. Actually, this answers. Let me word it this way: when you say a double negative is a positive, have a bachlal kasha. Why do you have to make a double negative to make it into a positive? Say nothing. Say nothing. That's always the kasha. Why do you have to speak crooked like this? Don't say la'achlam pasuk vav. Don't say la'achlam pasuk zayin, and everything is included. That's the application of kol medrash atadoirish v'shoiver medrash rishon ain't a medrash. Miyut achar miyut never means that the second miyut completely overturns the first miyut. That doesn't make sense. So the la'achla has to exclude, and it remains. And what is the la'achla excluding? That Michael Adam may never be used even for human medicinal purposes. That's it, only for eating. There's a presumption that even if the Torah would not have said la'achla and pasuk zayin, since they are juxtaposed, we would have applied the same. That's the premise of Rabbi Yossi's answer. We don't even need the la'achla and pasuk zayin because we would have compared one to the other. Same rules. Or right at the end of pasuk zayin, once la'achla, and we would understand it that it goes on both psukim. So that's called the miyut achar miyut. Miyut achar miyut is larabois, again, cannot mean larabois, so say nothing. And so this makes it work. We have a miyut. Michael Adam may not be used for Adam's non-food purposes. Michael behema because of the klal ein miut achar miut el rabbis, Michael Behema is allowed to be used even, not even, only for human non-food purposes. But again, there's a miut, because Michael Behema cannot be used for a animal's non-food purposes. I know that we are a lot more familiar with ein miut achar miut el rabbis, and this mama sheds light. Okay. One thing is the bottom line is, and that's the klal gadol amru, that human food is not limited, not human food, slicha. Animal food is not limited to be used only for animal consumption. If it's for a human need, it could be used for a human need, and it's not called that you're downgrading the chashivus or you're being machalel the kedusha of shvius, because adarabah, you're going from behema la'adam. The only thing is that the Mishnah spoke about melugma. The question the Gemara is going to have now is: are there other human non-food purposes for which I can use Michael Behema? That's going to be the continuation. So says the Gemara, asks the Gemara, Oichle Behema, something that by default is used, La Michael Behema, Ma'u Lasois Mehem Tzibuyim La Adam. Gevaldik. Whether you want to dye human skin, whether it's to dye human clothing, or I'll tell you more, even if it's to dye utensils, but that are miyuchadim La Adam. That's all La Adam. So is the Mishnah's halacha only milugma, or is it for everything? So the Gemara says, no, that's not a question. I'll tell you the response, and I'll tell you to you on a kal v'chaymer that ma im oichli adam, that the rule of the klal gadol amru she'ein oisem mehem milugma la adam, you may not use it l'milugma. Nevertheless, oisem mehem tzibuyim la adam. This is important. This we learned on the last chapter. This we learned in our pagination of Daf Nun Beis Amud Beis. I just want to add something, that what we said, and I'll repeat it because that's the halacha, that do you know what Michael Adam is allowed to be used, L'tzivoinim La Adam, if people also use it for that purpose? Not that you're making up, batla daitoi, but nevertheless, the fact that you are allowed to use something that's also usable for food, la'adam, you are allowed to use it to dye human clothing. So from that I have a kal v'chaymer, oichle behema, that's the whole klal gadol, that I'm allowed to use it, l'melugma la'adam, is like kolchchein, that it's even more chashuv if you use it, tzivoyim la'adam. And I'll tell you something, another way of wording it. I know we quoted words that are found more in the Bavli, but we had a braisa that had some of these words, which is shaval l'chol nefesh. If you remember, we had this in the previous chapter, and I think that the reason why, for sure, what's the logic? Why dying is for sure over medicine? Because medicine is not shaval l'chol nefesh. Medicine is only for the choyle. Masha'en kein, dying, everyone needs some of their stuff dyed. So that's a more common use. That's the way I would word it. So you're not deviating it from its use. The concept that you can use Michael Behema for humans, even non-food purposes, that we have in the Mishnah. But the Mishnah speaks about melugma, so madach melugma, that's only for cholim. It's not shaval l'chol nefesh is allowed to be used. That's the logic behind the kal v'chaymer. Avada, if it comes l'min etzivonim. And don't forget that anything that grows to dying is included in kedusha shvis. You see the chashivus that the Eibishter gives to products for dying. It's amazing. In other words, from Hashem's perspective, Hashem created certain plants for humans to have how to dye their things with, for the world not to be black and white, for there to be color. Okay. Now, next question. On the same base, it's now that we know that Michael Behema doesn't have to be used only La Michael Behema. If it's being used La Adam, for the Adam, even for non-food, Mine Melugmiyos. Mine Melugmiyos means if you have different plants that are primarily used for spices. Now, I want to take a little break, and the whole kash of the Gemara is based on the presumption, which won't be challenged today, that mine melugmayois, spices, are imbued with kedusha shvis. Can I take spices? It's now that you were machshiv so much tzivoyim, it's included in kedusha shvis. Well, that in itself doesn't make it more than spices, based on our presumption that spices are imbued with kedusha shvis. The reason why we're coming to this kasha is because we're saying that anything that can be used for a malugmeh, avade, for sure, it can be used l'tzivoim. Okay, so mini milogmeyos, ma'u lasis mehem l'tzivoim ba'adam. Right, you just said human food is allowed to be used l'tzivoim. So spices, are spices allowed to be used l'tzivoim? So the Gemara says, well, that's not even a kasha. Mo'im oichlei adam, which has the limitation of she'ein oisin mehem malugma la'adam. But as we just established, that oichlei adam are of shviz are allowed to be used tzivoyim la'adam. So mine melugmiyos. See, this we didn't have until now. Mine melugmiyos, even though it's imbued with kedusha shviz, spices are not meant to be eaten. So since spices are not designated lemaichol adam, they are allowed to be used lemelugma. Again, a given. Now we have a kavachaymer. So mini melugmiyos, that we know, even though it's imbued with kedusha shviz, she'oisim melugma la'adam is loy kolchchein shete'asa mehem tzuvayim la'adam. So this is a given. A given. It's almost like the Gemara is looking for where did they ask the question. It's almost like a question on a question. Oh, that couldn't have been the inquiry. No, that's for sure. What is it that they didn't know? So we're trying. Is loy tzarcha deloy. Loy tzarcha deloy means no. This is the kasha. This is the inquiry. Oichle behema. Here we go. Oichle behema cannot be used lemelugma lebehema. Can oichle behema be used litzivoyim lebehema? That's a great question. You see, oichle adam is allowed to be used to make dyes for human need, even though oichle adam may not be used lemelugma la adam. So now Michael behema can be used la adam. I want to know whether Michael behema is allowed to be used to make dyeings for animals. Same thing, whether it is to dye the animal skin, whether there are certain animals that have begodim. Here in Los Angeles, many animals have clothing v'chulei. Can you make it litzuvayim for that? That's the kasha. So says the Gemara, I will resolve this question, which is, let's compare it to oichlei adam again. That even though that's the klal gadol, she'ein oisin mehem melugma la'adam, nevertheless, that's the chiddush, that something, maichel adam, that's being used for dyeing, is somehow more chashuv. And I'll go with the Shabbat L'chol Nefesh. That's the lochem. That's what we learned in the previous chapter. Lochem la'achla. La'achla is excluding l'refuah. Lochem is for other purposes. Oisin mehem tzivoyim la'adam. Oy bazoi. Why would behema be different? Udekavasei. Oichle behema. True. That ein oisin melugma lebehema. You cannot use animal fodder designated by default for consumption of the animals. You can't use that into making a medicinal plaster for animals. Nevertheless, why would it be different? Nasamahem tzuvayim lebehema. In other words, the laws of animal food should parallel. Why should it not parallel? Fakert, if anything, it's more lenient. It's definitely not more chomer. So it should parallel. So l'chayda, that's a resolution to the inquiry. We have time. I know the Gabi doesn't like it, but we're going to go to Daf Samach Aleph. We have another whole 6 minutes. So Amar Rabbi Yosi, I disagree with your comparison. It does not parallel, and I'll tell you why. That mipnei ma oichlei adam. Why is it? Oisen mehem tzvayim lo adam. Why is it that way? I'll tell you why. Because by the fact that before we discuss what you are using it for, topic of Perek Ches, this is good words, What was the difference? What was Pedig Zayin? Pedig Zayin is not about what you're using it for. Pedig Zayin is what is imbued with Kedusha Shvius. And what was amazing is that aside of the fact that Shvius is more inclusive than Trumas U'Maisris, which only goes on Michael Adam, this goes even on a Michael Behema. But the Mishnah said more than that. The Mishnah said that even if there's a plant that primarily is used for dyeing purposes, it's equally included in Kedusha Shvius. So ma oichlei adam, mipnei ma oichlei adam. Why is it that oichlei adam is allowed to be used litzvayim la'adam? I'll tell you why. Shekein sivei adam yesh lahem kedusha gavaldik. And I'll tell you more. In other words, inedible plants that cannot be used for eating, the only purpose they have is for dyeing. Nevertheless, they are imbued with Kedusha Shvius, but here there's a caveat. When are they imbued with Kedusha Shvius? If the Halach Yelech, if it's common to use those products for dyeing for human purpose, whether it's the skin, we said whether it's garments for people, whether it's for kalim for people, but for human beings. But you're going to tell me to make a parallel, and you're giving it as I know the answer. I know it all. That you can use oichle adam to make dyeings for animal. No. I'll tell you why it might not be parallel. Because before we speak about what you're using it for, let's first see what the Torah included in the umbrella of Kedusha Shvius. Utzvayim lebehema eilehem Kedusha. That's gavaldik. That means if a plant is used in this society primarily to dye tzoyrech behema. Behemas, their kalim, it will not be included in Kedusha Shvius. See? So that's a whole different thing. So if the purpose of dyeing for animal is not significant enough for it to acquire Kedusha Shvius, think about it, then there is a logic to say that something that's miyuchad l'maychel behema, should not be allowed to use it litzavoim, because you are downgrading it. Mele, if you're using it to dye human needs, the fact that you're going from behema la'adam, it doesn't matter for what type of adam. Whether for eating, that was the whole limud of the Mishnah. That's a klal gadol. If you're going from animal to adam, doesn't have to be for food. Any non-food purpose, la adam is mutter. Why? Because you are upgrading it. But Michael behema and Tzivoyim behema is a downgrade, and therefore this inquiry is a gavaldik inquiry. In other words, I don't think the Gemara. You have to know how to learn the Yerushalmi. Lav dafka, we're concluding that you may for sure not use it. I think the Gemara is pointing out that this is an inquiry that's chashuv inquiry, because it's you can't resolve it. You can argue both sides of it. That's another way of learning the Gemara. And I think we'll stop over here.